It was just another regular afternoon at the daycare, but for Sarah, something felt a little different today. As the clock ticked closer to 5 p.m., the usual hum of laughter and chatter filled the air. Parents started arriving to pick up their children. Sarah had been working at the daycare for years, and each day followed a routine. Parents would arrive, greet their kids, and take them home. Nothing out of the ordinary. But today, as she looked up from her desk, something caught her attention. Mike, one of the fathers, had arrived to pick up his daughter, Emily. Emily was a quiet, sweet girl who Sarah adored. She had a little blonde ponytail that always made her look like she was ready for an adventure. Sarah watched as Emily ran to her dad with a big smile on her face, excited to go home. Mike's face lit up too, but there was something about the way he moved that didn't seem quite right. Sarah couldn't quite place it, but the small unease she felt in her chest was hard to ignore. Mike always seemed like an easygoing dad, a guy who was friendly, a bit reserved, but never too hurried. But today, as he bent down to pick up Emily, Sarah noticed his eyes darting around the room. He seemed distracted, as if he couldn't wait to leave. He hurriedly gathered Emily's things, not making any small talk with the other parents, which was unusual. Normally, he'd chat for a few minutes, share a laugh about something funny that happened at work, or ask how Emily's day went. But today, he barely acknowledged anyone else. It wasn't just the rushed manner or the lack of conversation that seemed off. It was the way Mike's body language had shifted. Normally, he was relaxed, but today he was tense, stiff, and almost as if he was trying to avoid being seen too much. It was subtle, but Sarah could feel it. She watched as Mike helped Emily put on her little jacket. There was a brief moment when he seemed to hesitate before he helped her with the zipper, and that brief pause felt out of place. His usual patience with Emily, even in the smallest tasks, seemed missing. Instead of gently guiding her as he always did, his movements were quick, almost rushed. Sarah couldn't help herself. As she saw Mike and Emily walk toward the door, she felt a strange knot in her stomach. She was a caregiver, and she had been trained to observe the children, yes, but also the parents. Sometimes, the little things, tiny moments, a change in tone or demeanor, told her something more than words ever could. It was an instinct, something deep down inside her that had made her good at her job. But today, Mike's behavior felt different. It didn't feel like the usual goodbye. Sarah found herself feeling uneasy, questioning if it was just her imagination or if something more was at play. She knew that it could be nothing, just a man who had a busy day and was eager to get home. But the feeling in her gut told her to trust her instincts. There was something about Mike's behavior today that felt off, and she couldn't let it go. As Mike left with Emily in his arms, Sarah decided to keep an eye on him. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this simple pickup than met the eye. As she stood by the window, watching them walk away, a small voice inside her told her to stay alert. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Sarah knew she would be paying attention the next time Mike came to pick up Emily. The next morning, Sarah tried to push the strange feeling she had about Mike to the back of her mind. She reminded herself that it was probably nothing. After all, parents had all kinds of reasons for being a little off sometimes. Maybe Mike had just had a bad day or was in a hurry. Still, as the hours passed, the unease lingered in her thoughts, like a whisper she couldn't quite ignore. It was just a little after lunch when Sarah found herself thinking about Mike again. She had seen parents come and go throughout the day, but something about his interaction with Emily the previous afternoon stayed with her. It wasn't just the way he rushed out of the daycare or his quick goodbye. No, it was the feeling that Sarah couldn't shake, the gut instinct telling her something wasn't quite right. She thought back to his eyes, darting around the room. Why hadn't he stayed to chat like he usually did with the other parents? Why was he so eager to leave? As Sarah went about her duties, making sure the kids were comfortable and their activities were running smoothly, she couldn't help but glance at the clock. The moment Mike was supposed to pick up Emily was approaching, and Sarah's stomach fluttered. Her mind was telling her to calm down, to trust that everything was fine. But her intuition wasn't ready to let go of the feeling that something wasn't right. She had learned over the years to listen to her instincts, to pay attention to subtle shifts in behavior. There were always patterns, and when something disrupted that pattern, it was worth noticing. With a child like Emily, Sarah had grown attached over time, and the thought of anything being off in her life was enough to make her uneasy. The daycare was meant to be a safe place, not just for the kids but also for the parents who trusted the caregivers to help raise their children. As the end of the day approached, Sarah started to feel that tension in the air again. It wasn't long before she saw Mike pulling up in his usual car. He stepped out, glancing at his watch before heading inside. The same hurried pace as yesterday. Sarah tried not to stare, but her eyes followed him as he walked through the door. The same sense of urgency seemed to hang around him. She noted how he didn't make eye contact with any of the other parents as he walked in, almost as if he were trying to avoid any interaction. But there was something else. As he neared the playroom where Emily was waiting, Sarah saw his posture tighten. His steps were quick, almost too quick, as if he was eager to get out of the room. Sarah couldn't understand it. He had never been like this before, always calm and collected. His relationship with Emily was always warm, and they had a good rapport. But today something was different. It was like he couldn't wait to leave, and that alone made Sarah's heart race a little faster. Mike reached Emily, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe it was just a small change, something that had nothing to do with anything serious. But when she watched him hurriedly scoop Emily into his arms, her stomach twisted. There was a flicker of discomfort on his face that she couldn't ignore. Sarah tried to stay calm. She continued her work, but her eyes kept drifting toward Mike and Emily. Her mind told her not to worry, but her gut told her something was off. Why was Mike acting this way? And why did it feel like Emily wasn't the only one being rushed out the door? As Mike walked out of the daycare with Emily in his arms, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd be thinking about Mike and his odd behavior. Something in her gut told her that she needed to keep her eyes open. And for some reason, Sarah couldn't help but feel that today might be the day she figured out what was really going on. The days passed, but Sarah couldn't let go of the strange feeling she had about Mike. Each time she thought about it, the knot in her stomach tightened. She tried to tell herself it was just a momentary worry, something that would fade away with time. But it didn't. Every little detail about Mike's behavior from that day kept replaying in her mind like an unfinished story. She found herself thinking about it more often than she wanted to admit. Her mind wandered back to that afternoon. How Mike had rushed to pick up Emily, how he had barely made eye contact with anyone, how his body language had been tense and defensive. None of it made sense. She had known Mike for a while, and he had always been easygoing, friendly, and warm with Emily. There had never been anything to make her doubt him as a parent. But something was different now, and it was nagging at her like a puzzle she couldn't solve. As Sarah went about her daily routines at the daycare, she found herself looking for patterns in the parents' behavior. She started paying closer attention to how they interacted with their children, how they carried themselves when they came to pick them up. It was part of her job, of course, to keep an eye on things, but now it felt like she was hyper-aware of every small detail. It wasn't just about the kids anymore. It was about understanding the adults too. But no one else seemed to stand out like Mike. The other parents were all behaving normally, chatting with their kids, exchanging pleasantries with the other caregivers. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Yet every time she saw Mike, that unease crept back into her chest. It wasn't just a passing thought anymore. It had become a constant, lingering question. Had she misread him? Could it have been nothing more than a bad day for him? Maybe he had been stressed about work or something personal, something that didn't involve Emily at all. It was possible, right? She could have been imagining it, overthinking it. But deep down, Sarah knew that wasn't the case. There was more to the story, and something in her gut told her she was meant to figure it out. She decided to observe him more closely the next time he came to pick up Emily. Her intuition hadn't let her down before, and she wasn't about to ignore it now. But she also knew she couldn't jump to conclusions. There were too many unknowns, and she couldn't risk making a mistake. So, Sarah resolved to keep quiet about her concerns, at least for now. She would keep her distance, watch his actions carefully, and see if there was anything she could find that might explain his strange behavior. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing one, Sarah became more determined to get to the bottom of it. She knew something was wrong, even if she couldn't explain what it was. The quiet whispers in her mind grew louder, telling her that Mike's behavior wasn't just a fluke, it was a sign of something bigger. Each day, she watched him from a distance, waiting for a moment that would reveal the truth. She didn't want to accuse him of anything without proof, but Sarah's instincts were telling her that the truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before she uncovered it. Every time Mike came to pick up Emily, she felt that familiar tug in her chest, a reminder that something was off. The puzzle was still incomplete, but Sarah was determined to solve it, no matter what it took. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She had been thinking about Mike nonstop, and she couldn't ignore the pull to figure out what was going on. As she went through her day, helping the kids with their activities and making sure everything ran smoothly, her mind kept drifting back to Mike's strange behavior. It had been nagging at her for days now, and she couldn't let it go. She was working in the daycare office when she saw Mike's car pull into the parking lot. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the moment she had been waiting for, though she wasn't exactly sure what to expect. She told herself to stay calm and just observe, to keep her distance and see if anything about his behavior stood out again. But the truth was, she felt nervous. She didn't know what she was hoping to find. Maybe a clue, maybe just a sign that her concerns were unfounded. When Mike entered the daycare, he looked almost the same as usual. His worn jeans, a casual jacket, his eyes looking everywhere, but at anyone. He didn't seem to notice Sarah standing near the window, watching him. She had always found him to be polite, easygoing, but today, it was like he was in another world. He moved quickly, as if he was trying to avoid eye contact with anyone, his steps quick and purposeful. But there was something else that caught her attention, his expression. The friendly face he usually wore had vanished. Today, there was a hint of something on his face. Maybe guilt, maybe unease, but whatever it was, it made Sarah's heart beat faster. He was acting so differently from the man she had seen just days before. Sarah had always felt that Mike was a decent father, but now, in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if something had changed. She had promised herself she would remain detached, not make any judgments based on a feeling, but she couldn't help herself. Mike's behavior was just too unusual. It was as though he was trying to keep a secret. Sarah had seen this kind of thing before with other parents, how they would behave strangely when something was off in their lives. But Mike was different. He wasn't hiding behind a wall of anger or frustration like other parents did. His behavior was subtle, almost like he was trying to slip under the radar. As he walked toward the playroom, Sarah felt that same tension building inside her. She waited, keeping her eyes on him as he entered the room and bent down to greet Emily. But today, unlike other days, his movements seemed jerky. He didn't kneel down in his usual calm way to talk to his daughter. Instead, he rushed through the motions, quickly gathering her things, all the while glancing around the room, almost like he didn't want anyone to see him. Sarah's stomach turned. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the Mike she knew. And for the first time since she'd started noticing his strange behavior, she realized that maybe her gut feeling wasn't wrong. Maybe something was happening, something that needed to be addressed. She couldn't just ignore it any longer. As she watched Mike scoop Emily into his arms, the unease in her chest only grew. It wasn't just about his hasty movements anymore. It was the way he was acting around his daughter. He seemed distant, almost disconnected from her, as if his mind was somewhere else. It didn't sit well with Sarah. She had seen the bond between them before, Mike was always so gentle with Emily, so involved in her little world. But now she was seeing something entirely different. For the first time, Sarah felt her instincts pull her in another direction. It wasn't enough to just watch from afar anymore. She had to know what was really going on. And so, as Mike walked out the door with Emily, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't let it go any longer. She had to follow him. She needed to see what was happening when the doors closed behind them, when the daycare was no longer in the picture. Her heart raced as she quietly made her way to the door, waiting for the right moment. The time had come to find out the truth. Sarah waited quietly by the door, her heart beating a little faster with each passing second. She had made up her mind to follow Mike. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, but something in her gut told her that she needed to know. The daycare was winding down for the day, and parents were beginning to pick up their children. As the door opened, and Mike stepped out with Emily in his arms, Sarah took a deep breath, silently following behind them, careful not to be seen. She kept her distance, watching as Mike walked briskly down the sidewalk. Emily, still in her jacket, rested her head on her father's shoulder, looking content. To the outside world, everything appeared normal, but Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more going on than what met the eye. Mike seemed to be in a hurry, his steps faster than usual, and he didn't even seem to notice the few people walking past him. As Sarah followed, she noticed something that sent a shiver down her spine. Mike's body language was tense, almost rigid, like he was keeping something hidden. His eyes flicked over his shoulder a couple of times, as though he was checking to see if anyone was watching him. Sarah's heart rate quickened. She wasn't sure if he knew she was behind him, but something about the way he was acting made her think he did. They continued down the street, and Sarah stayed a good distance away, careful to keep her movements as quiet as possible. She tried not to let her curiosity get the best of her, but the longer she followed, the more she became convinced that something was off. It wasn't just the hurried pace or the way he looked around nervously. It was the way he was carrying himself, as if he was trying to avoid being noticed. A few minutes later, Mike turned a corner and entered a small, quiet park. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then followed him in. She stood just behind a large tree, peeking around its trunk to keep an eye on him. From her position, she could see Mike talking to a woman sitting on a park bench. Sarah's curiosity got the best of her, and she inched a little closer, trying to get a better look. The woman was striking, tall, with dark hair and a confident posture. She looked nothing like Emily's mother, and Sarah found herself wondering who she was. The way Mike and the woman were interacting made Sarah feel uneasy. It wasn't just the conversation they were having, it was the body language. Mike was standing a little too close to her, his posture stiff, and his hands were fidgeting. He seemed on edge, like he was trying to keep something under control. For a moment, the woman reached up and placed a hand on Mike's arm, and that was when Sarah felt the first real wave of suspicion. The gesture was casual, but it felt too intimate, too familiar for someone who was just a friend. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if Mike had been hiding something from Emily, from everyone. Her stomach twisted in knots as she watched the two of them talk, and it was becoming increasingly clear that there was more to this situation than she had first thought. She felt a pang of guilt for eavesdropping, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She needed to know what was going on. Why had Mike acted so strange at the daycare? Why had he been so nervous, so secretive? And who was this woman? As the conversation between Mike and the woman continued, Sarah's mind raced. Was this the secret Mike had been hiding all along? Was this woman someone important in his life? And why had he been so careful not to let anyone find out? The questions piled up in her mind, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't just stand there and watch forever. She had to confront him, had to get to the bottom of what was really happening. The woman stood up and hugged Mike, a long, tight embrace that left Sarah feeling like she had uncovered something she wasn't meant to see. The moment lingered in the air as Mike stepped back, his face flushed and his eyes shifting away from the woman. And just like that, They parted ways. Mike walking back toward the street with Emily still in his arms, the woman heading in the opposite direction. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized that her gut feeling had been right all along. There was more to Mike's story than he had let on. It wasn't just a simple mistake or a one-time occurrence. There was a hidden layer to his life, one that was now impossible for Sarah to ignore. The truth was starting to unravel, and she knew this was only the beginning of discovering what Mike had been keeping from everyone. Sarah stood there for a moment, her heart racing as she watched Mike walk away with Emily. The encounter between him and the woman had left her with more questions than answers. She couldn't deny it any longer. Something was off, and it was time for her to confront Mike. But she wasn't sure how to approach him. After all, she wasn't just a casual observer in this situation. She was responsible for Emily, and that made everything more complicated. As she walked back to the daycare, her mind replayed the scene over and over. Mike's hurried behavior, his nervous glances, the way he interacted with the woman. It all painted a picture that made her uneasy. Sarah had never imagined that Mike, someone she had always seen as a loving and attentive father, could be hiding something so secretive. By the time she reached the daycare, the last of the parents were leaving, and the evening was settling in. Sarah felt a sense of urgency building inside her. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to speak to Mike, to get to the bottom of this. She couldn't ignore it any longer, not when Emily's safety and well-being were involved. She quickly checked the parking lot, and there, just as she expected, Mike's car was still parked outside. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't sure how Mike would react, but she had to do this. She couldn't just keep watching from the sidelines. She had to know the truth. Walking towards his car, Sarah found herself hesitating for a moment. What if she was wrong? What if it was all just a misunderstanding? She tried to push those thoughts out of her head. Her instincts had been telling her something wasn't right, and she wasn't about to ignore them now. When Mike saw her approach, his expression changed almost immediately. He seemed startled, like he hadn't expected anyone to approach him at this moment. His eyes flicked around briefly, almost as if he were looking for a way out of the conversation. But Sarah was determined. She had to speak to him, and now was as good a time as any. "Mike, can we talk for a minute?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Mike's face stiffened, and for a brief second, Sarah thought he might try to avoid her. But instead, he nodded, giving her a half-hearted smile. "Sure, Sarah. What's up?" There was an awkward silence between them. Sarah didn't waste any time. She went straight to the point, not wanting to dance around it any longer. "I noticed something today," she began, keeping her voice steady. "And I think it's time to talk about it. Yesterday when you picked up Emily, you seemed different. You were acting a little nervous, rushing through things. And then, today when I followed you, I saw you with that woman in the park. What's going on, Mike?" Mike's face instantly changed, his expression turning from surprise to defensive. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then paused, his eyes darting away. Sarah could see the discomfort in his body language. He was clearly caught off guard by her question, and for a moment, she wondered if he would try to lie his way out of it. I didn't mean for you to see that," Mike finally muttered, his voice quiet. "It's not what you think." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting him to deny it, to brush it off, but the way he said those words made it clear that there was more to the story than he was letting on. His face was flushed, his hands shifting nervously by his sides. "It's just complicated, okay?" he added quickly, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't want Emily to get caught up in any of this. She doesn't need to know about it." Sarah felt her stomach twist with both confusion and frustration. She didn't know what he meant, but she could tell that there was more to the story. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it, but she knew she had to. For Emily's sake, she couldn't back down now. "Complicated," Sarah repeated, trying to keep her voice even. "What's going on, Mike?" You've been acting strange for days now, and I'm worried. I need you to be honest with me." Mike sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the situation was finally getting to him. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking away for a long moment before meeting her gaze again. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice softer now. "I never wanted anyone to find out this way. I've been seeing someone else, a woman from work. We've been talking for a while now. It's complicated because I don't want Emily to know about it. I don't want her to think that I'm not focused on her, or that something's wrong between me and her mom." Sarah stood there, stunned. She hadn't expected this. The truth hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she didn't know how to process it. The man she had known for so long, someone she had trusted, was hiding a secret life, one that involved a relationship with. Sarah stood there, trying to process everything Mike had just told her. His confession weighed heavily in the air, and she could feel the tension tightening around her chest. She had never expected this, a hidden relationship, a secret he had kept from everyone, especially from Emily. She had thought the strange behavior was just a passing oddity, something she could chalk up to stress or a bad day. But now everything made sense in a way that made her uneasy. For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything. She was trying to absorb it all, her mind racing through the implications. She had known Mike for a while now, seen him with Emily countless times, and never in a million years would she have guessed that something like this was happening under the surface. She could see the regret in his eyes, the shame that had crept in since he admitted the truth. But at the same time, there was something else, something raw, like he was caught between guilt and confusion. He was lost, and for the first time, Sarah realized how much he needed to make a choice. But the question was, what was that choice? "Mike," Sarah started, her voice a little softer now. She didn't want to be harsh, but the situation was complicated. All of this affects Emily. You can't just keep things hidden from her. She deserves to know what's going on. And more than that, you need to be honest with her. She's not just a little girl who won't understand. Mike's shoulders slumped further, and Sarah could see the weight of her words landing on him. He was silent for a few moments, and in that silence, Sarah could feel how deeply conflicted he was. She knew that he cared about Emily. He had always been a good father in her eyes, attentive and loving. But now she was seeing a different side of him, a man struggling with decisions that could change everything. "I know," Mike said quietly, looking down at the ground. "I know she deserves better than this. I didn't want to hurt her. I thought I could keep it all separate, keep her life normal. But I've realized that's not possible. I've messed up, Sarah. I'm just trying to figure out how to fix it." Sarah could hear the genuine remorse in his voice. It wasn't an excuse. It was a plea for understanding. She wasn't sure if she could give that to him right now. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emily. She couldn't ignore the fact that Emily had already seen the changes in Mike's behavior, the distance, the rushed goodbyes. Children were perceptive, more so than adults often realized, and Emily wasn't immune to the tension in the air. "You have to talk to her, Mike," Sarah said firmly. "She's your daughter. She needs to hear the truth from you, not from anyone else. And she needs to see that you're committed to making things right, even if that means making some hard decisions. You can't just sweep this under the rug and hope it all works out." Mike nodded slowly, his face drawn with the weight of her words. He knew she was right, but Sarah could see how difficult it was for him to imagine facing Emily with this truth. It wasn't just about breaking the news to her. It was about everything that came with it. The hurt, the confusion, the changes in their family dynamic. And that wasn't something Mike had been ready to face until now. But now the time had come. "I don't know how to start," Mike admitted, running his hand through his hair. "I don't know what to say to her. She's so young. I don't want to break her heart." Sarah gave him a sympathetic look, her expression softening. "I can't tell you exactly what to say, Mike. But I can tell you that honesty is the best way. She'll feel it if you're holding back or trying to sugarcoat things. You just have to be open with her, even if it's hard. Mike took a deep breath, clearly trying to find the courage to face the truth of the situation. His eyes were heavy with uncertainty, but Sarah could see the resolve starting to build. He wasn't the same man she had seen just a few minutes ago. There was a change in him, a willingness to face the consequences of his actions. And that was a start. "I'll talk to her tonight," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I'll tell her everything. I won't hide anything anymore." Sarah nodded. She didn't know if things would be okay for Emily after this, but she knew that Mike's decision to confront the truth was a step in the right direction. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be a lot of emotions to deal with, but at least they would be facing it head-on. There was no more running away. As Mike turned to leave, Sarah felt a mix of relief and concern. She hoped he would follow through, that he would find a way to mend things with Emily. But above all, she hoped Emily would feel the love that still existed, despite the cracks in their world. The truth was hard, but it was the only way forward. And for Emily's sake, Sarah would be there to support them both, no matter what came next. That evening, Mike went home with a heavy heart. The words Sarah had spoken lingered in his mind as he walked through his front door. He had promised to talk to Emily, to finally tell her the truth. But as he entered their home, the reality of what he was about to do began to weigh on him even more. He wasn't just facing Emily's disappointment. He was facing his own fears, his own guilt for allowing things to get this far. Emily was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her little face buried in a picture book. She looked up when she heard him come in, her eyes lighting up with the familiar smile he had seen 1,000 times. It made his heart ache even more. She had no idea what was about to change. She didn't know that the world she had known, the world she thought was stable and safe, was about to shift. Mike took a deep breath and walked over to her, trying to push aside the knot in his stomach. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, sitting down beside her. "Hi, Daddy," Emily chirped, her small voice full of innocence. She scooted over to make room for him, offering him the book. "I'm reading my favorite story. Want to listen?" Mike smiled at her, but there was no joy in it. "Maybe later, sweetheart," he said, his voice sounding tired even to his own ears. He had to do this now, before he lost his courage. He gently placed the book aside, his hand resting on Emily's. "I need to talk to you about something, Emily," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "Something important." Her little face, filled with curiosity, looked up at him. "What's wrong, Daddy? You don't look happy." Mike took another deep breath. He wasn't sure where to start, how to explain everything without causing her too much pain. But there was no easy way out of this. He had to be honest. He had to be real, even if it broke his heart to see the worry growing in her eyes. "Sweetheart, I've been keeping a secret from you," Mike said quietly. "And I know it's not right. You know how much I love you, right?" Emily nodded, her small hand tightening around his. "I love you too, Daddy. You're my best friend." Mike's heart cracked at her words. He wanted to hold her close, shield her from this, but he knew he couldn't. This was something she had to know, something she would eventually have to understand. "I've been seeing someone else, Emily," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Not your mom. It's someone from work, and I've been keeping it from you and Mom for a long time now." Emily blinked, confusion clouding her face. Someone else. But why? Mike felt a pang in his chest. "I don't know how it happened. I made mistakes, and I wasn't honest with you or with your mom. I didn't want to hurt anyone, and I thought maybe if I kept it all secret, nothing would change. But now, I see that I was wrong. And I'm really sorry, Emily." She stared at him, her small brows furrowing in confusion. "You love me, right, Daddy?" Mike's heart tightened as he nodded. "Of course I do, sweetheart. More than anything. That will never change. But sometimes, adults make mistakes, and I've made a big one. I need you to understand that this isn't your fault. I'll always love you, and I'll always be here for you. but I have to figure out how to make things right, and that's going to take time." Emily seemed to be processing his words, her little face serious as she clutched her book. Mike wished he could take away the confusion, the worry, but he knew it wasn't that simple. He could only offer her the truth and hope that, with time, she would understand. "You'll still be here with me, right?" Emily asked quietly, her voice small and uncertain. Mike felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'll always be here, Emily," he reassured her. "I promise. No matter what happens, I'll always be here." For a moment, Emily didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for reassurance that everything would be okay. Mike could see the trust in her eyes, and it made him feel even more guilty for keeping this from her for so long. But at least now she knew. At least now. The truth was out there, and they could start dealing with it. "I love you, Daddy," Emily said softly, giving him a hug. Mike held her tightly, his heart aching with the weight of everything that had happened. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to make things right for Emily. He didn't know how to fix everything, but he was going to try. He owed her that. As the evening went on, the weight of his confession still hung in the air. Emily seemed to accept it, but Mike knew that things would never be the same. They would have to rebuild their relationship, slowly, one step at a time. He had broken something, and he wasn't sure how to repair it, but he had made the first step by being honest. That was the most he could do right now. And maybe, just maybe, honesty was the first step toward healing.